Historically, one of the most difficult New Testament books to interpret has been the letter of James. So let's talk about some tips for reading the letter of James. Hello, welcome to Clarity and Brevity. Today I want to look at 4 tips, plus a bonus tip, for how to read the letter of James. 4 lenses we can use to help us make sense of this letter that is often difficult to interpret. And these 4 lenses really are other portions of Scripture. How do we read James? Well, the first lens we can use to read James is to read James in light of wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Wisdom literature. Now, this is a broad term, but the term basically refers to books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, books like this that are not giving us a narrative. They are giving us insights into how to apply the law of God to our lives with these short, pithy statements. And James has been called something like New Testament wisdom literature. James quotes Proverbs in his book. And as you read James, he gives us these memorable statements often. Sometimes sections will conclude with memorable statements. And these statements are like statements from wisdom literature that invite us to reflect on what has been said and understand how it applies to our lives. A second lens is the Old Testament prophets. James has been called a New Testament prophet. He looks like the prophet of Amos, for example, or maybe the prophet Jeremiah. What did the prophets do? Well, often the prophets would speak to God's people, those who knew what God had said, and they would critique them, they would reprove them for not living according with what they knew to be true. They would call out hypocrisy. They would call God's people to live in accord with God's law and do those things that God really requires. Not just external obedience, but internal obedience as well. And when James talks about the double-minded person, he's talking about hypocrisy in a way that recalls the types of things that the Old Testament prophets were often speaking about as well. A third lens is the lens of the Gospels. Now, James was probably written before the Gospels. But as you think about James in relation to the prophets, also think about James in relation to Jesus himself, who is the greatest prophet. Sometimes what James gives us in his letter looks a lot like the teaching of Jesus. For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, if you were to read the Sermon on the Mount, for example, about not swearing, and read what James 5 says about not swearing, you can see very similar teaching there. James is giving us the teaching of Jesus that has been, he's reflected on it and is applying it for his audience. So as you read James and you come across perhaps difficult passages in James, one of the questions you might ask is this related to what Jesus gives us, what Jesus tells us in the Gospels? That's a third lens. Here's a fourth lens for reading James. Read James in light of Paul's letters, and read James in light of other New Testament letters. Now let me explain. Sometimes James has been taken to look different than Paul, and certainly James and Paul say things in a little bit of a different way. But there's also a lot of parallels between James and Paul. If you want to compare James to Paul's letters, let's say James to Ephesians. Don't just look at Ephesians 1-6 and James 1-5. Because in the first 3 chapters of Ephesians, Paul has given us a lot more of theological reflection on the work of Christ. Now, in the last 3 chapters, Ephesians 4-6, Paul is reflecting on the implications or the application of that theology. So if you want to compare James to Paul, don't look at, let's say, Ephesians 1-6 and James 1-5. Instead, look at Ephesians 4-6 and James 1-5. Look at those sections in Paul where he is applying his teaching and teaching us how we ought to live as disciples. Because what James does is he does not include that extended reflection on the theology, that is the what we might call the great indicative of salvation that Paul reflects upon, what God has done for us through Christ. Instead, what James is giving us is he's jumping right into the application, assuming the theology, the theological foundation, but jumping right into the application. And when you look at James in relation to Paul's letters in the last half of Ephesians, you're actually going to find a lot of parallels. But it's not only Paul's letters. James is also part of of the section of the New Testament today we call the Catholic Epistles. And so James looks a lot like 1 Peter. So 2 Peter, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. That's the section of these letters. These are different letters than Paul's letters, but James through Jude, this is a place where James finds a happy home in the New Testament canon, you might say. What we have here is other letters that are quite similar to James. So don't just think of James in relation to Paul. Think also of James in relation to other New Testament letters not written by Paul. And here's the bonus lens. I said there were actually 5 points. And here's the bonus. Don't just read James in a way to seek to gain information. As we read James, we're actually to place ourselves under its authority. We are to understand not just theoretically, for example, how does James relate to Paul, or what does this or that verse mean? But as we read James, as with all of Scripture, we need to understand that James is the authority over us. He's an apostle, and we are to receive his word by faith and seek to bring our lives by God's grace into greater conformity with the message. So there's 5 lenses that may help you as you seek to read the letter of James. Thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.